Yeah, no, I love it. Well, I've done a few different 10-day silent retreats, Vipassana retreats, where you kind of sit in silence. There's no eye contact with anyone. It's a very kind of inner journey, and I've had very psychedelic like experiences on those retreats, and I think it's
Right.
it's a very strong place of that, taking a step back and just witnessing all this stuff that is my mind and my body and all the different, like, there's you waking up at 4 every day to start meditation at 4:30, and then you're not getting to bed till 9, and so it's like 14 hours a day of sitting in your ass and with your eyes closed, and there's process to it. But yeah, I feel like there's I can express experiences that I've had there, but I think the benefits of going to that experience are something that can only be experienced yourself, in the same way that a psychedelic experience can't be given to someone else. Like I'd recommend trying out something like that for anyone who has the time and to take 10 days out of their life to sit on their butt. But in terms of like, what is that? Like, I don't know. It seems like a natural, it seems natural in some sense. Like maybe the thing that is fundamental in terms of awareness, that is just what that is. It's just like a capacity to not be taken by anything in particular, and just kind of like be like that, beingness in some sense. But
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to postulate too much about what, I don't know.
I don't know. I relate to it as, like, on the one hand, obviously you're trying to minimize the noise, but actually I kind of prefer a different way of relating to it, which is, I think of my mind as like a radio. And rather than trying to minimize the noise, instead I'm like playing with the knob and trying to hear music in the noise or something like that. Like, it's
Mm,
hard to explain exactly what I'm doing, but it's something like I'm like trying to kind of tune out enough to tune into something that's hard, that's not localized to any specific frequency, or it's something to do with the willingness to let my mind go wherever it wants to go. You know what I mean? Um, but it's almost like you're tuning into that through the noise. So it's not so much trying to block it out as using it as a kind of as information of some kind, as something
mm,
to it's like you're practicing balancing between focusing in on any specific part
That's
and
it.
being so open that you're not getting anything. You know what I mean? It's like a balance there where you're trying, kind of playing with the dial, playing with that tuner,
mm.
and you're kind of trying to, trying to stop yourself from tipping in either direction, I guess.
And there's some sense that there's a skill to that, but there's also a sense that there's like a possible mapping of some kind. Like, I'm really interested in, especially coming from a psychotherapeutic background, the mappings of existing psychotherapeutic models are, a sense, trying to figure out what's going on in the mind, right? Like including that aspect of and talking about in McGraw-Hiss left and right hemisphere, and like I see that as almost like one axis of many, right? Like if you overlay these different axes of these capacities, you start to get this map of possible, like there's like information, and there's how we interpret information, and there's like how we respond to the information, and yeah, so there's some way that we can get more skillful at understanding what's going on there by creating these maps. And my excitement, at least in that map making, is how do I then relate it back to my metaphysics, and like how do I relate it back to what I think is structuring everything as well. But that's a bit of an aside. But
Well, I think an equally interesting place to look for a connection is practice in relation to something like synchronicity, and that
mm,
actually for me is where I see meditation as being like very practical and related to this sort of skillful curation of circumstances that are conducive to synchronistic happenings. Is there's something about that balancing on the knife's edge of being tuned in and being tuned out that is really helpful for synchronicity, because you need to be open enough to notice the odd things that are like, it's like the universe speaking in a language you don't recognize, but it is a language, though it means something. but at the same time, you have to be like focused enough to actually figure out what it means, right? You
Mm.
can't just be anything. You can't just like gloss over it like, oh, that's interesting, moving on.
Yeah.
There's like a balancing act there where you have to kind of focus in and maintain that wide kind of peripheral vision that where you're looking for the next clue, the next firefly.
Does it need to be focused in order to be able to bring something back from those
I think
sort of,
so. Yeah, I think
you
so.
know,
I
so
think
yeah, you need to retain a little bit of logic
I think it does
somehow.
it. It's not doesn't necessarily have to be focused in the moment. Like and most people don't have the focus in the moment. Most people cultivate focus retrospectively, like you might analyze a dream, and they go, "Well,
Mm,
this is very odd." And actually, when I look at it, oh my god, look at that! Like it's almost like I was meant to do this. Like it's almost like the
mm,
universe was urging me, or
yeah.
so it's retrospective. But I think, and this is part of what what I learned from my ex-mentor was, there's a set of skills related to like not just making it happen but staying in it. He called it stalking synchronicity. You want to get close enough to touch the wild creature that absolutely does not want you to touch it, and then
Mm,
somehow you want to try and stay, you want to like try and ride it like a wave, or like a it's really strange, like because the
mm,
metaphor then shifts dramatically, because like how it's like almost like the synchronicity is always pointing beyond your way of relating to it, so but
mm,
there's a sense in which you're trying to hold on to that, right? That magical experience is like, this is important, and I want more of that, and I want to see where it leads. I want to go down that yellow brick road. I want to go across the rainbow bridge and find the pot of gold. And that's the crazy thing is that when you're in that state, when you're following the flow, you can tell there's a pot of gold. And
mm,
and you come back to mundane reality and you're like, but is there? It's like,
mm.
it's like this fanciful thing. But when you're in it, you fucking
Yeah.
know.
Mm. I feel like synchronicity has a danger to it as well, in that it can kind of be like a drug, in the sense of like
Yeah.
when you feel that pot of golden potential, you can then sort of look around and be like, where's the next synchronicity? And kind of like you're looking
Yes,
for it, like, oh, that person's looking at me
exactly.
weird. I'm going to walk over to them and be like, hey, you got
Yeah.
something to tell me? And there's sort of a
Yeah.
wrong way of approaching it as
And
well.
that's what I mean. This is why,
Mm,
most people just get bursts and then they retrospectively do logic on it, right? If you're
mm,
trying to like ride the beast, say, you need to be capable of doing the epistemological work in real time, like at all times. Not, you can't, as soon as there's an interruption to the epistemological work, you start to get off track. And as soon as you start to get off track, like you're right, there is a danger to it. But the great thing about synchronicity is the danger self terminates. As soon as you start leaving the path,
mm,
like the amplification thing starts to fade and you're left just like kind of like with fragments, and you're like, what happened? I don't know what
Mm.
happened.
Well, I have a very interesting synchronistic story, maybe for another time. That was, the teaching was to be more discerning about synchronicities, and in that sense of like looking for something, like having an attitude of like, where is it? And then the synchronicity itself ended up being like, yeah, that's be cautious
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah, of course,
mm,
because there is that tendency to read into it, and you can really get lost. Like I think there's a danger, especially for people who have a predisposition to mental illness, where they also generally are more open to genuine synchronistic phenomena, and that's part of the difficulty of their illness. Is that's part of what wants the doctor wants to kind of say, this is not real. You know what I mean?
mm,
Which is hard
mm,
if they're like, nah, man, that part's definitely real. That's really
mm,
difficult then to get them, convince them that they are in fact ill, even if they are. But there's that difficulty of, if you're prone to a mental illness and you start to dabble in synchronicity, it's easy for that to get out of hand and for you to start to accrue baggage, conceptual and emotional baggage, that
mm,
isn't related so much to what the synchronicity is teaching you, so much as it's related to what you'd really like to hear, say, or what
mm,
what you're like, what you imagine is the ideal solution to your problems, and then that's what you read the synchronicity
mm,
as, and that really gets you into trouble a lot of the time.
mm.
Hmm. What about you, Matt? Do you have a kind of relationship, a particular relationship with synchronicity in your experience?
Yeah.
I don't think so. I mean, yes, 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 of course, but I don't have an understanding of it, though. I mean,
Mm.
that's why I'm absolutely fascinated by what you're saying here. But for me, it seems to be it suggests that there is some kind of telos that transcends me,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
But I wanted to ask about that, because you could still look at this just as an individual experience, couldn't you? You could say, well, this is just my story, and these synchronicities is the way I represent my deep questions, or my struggles, or my shadow, or these
sure, yeah,
things swimming under the surface, as we discussed earlier. Or you could say, well, actually, no, as Mike Levin was suggesting, it's kind of like a higher order sort of communication. You need to be doing this, right?
yeah.
So our presence here as a threesome today, for example, could be,
Is
not ordained, but
no, it is.
there's a reason why we found ourselves here, because
Yeah,
of some
no,
journey or other.
no. If it is,
It just is. It just is. Yeah. Well, yeah. So what my relationship with it is to kind of observe it, right, and wonder about it, and then just
yeah,
go along the paths that are laid out for me, and without questioning them too much. And I think that's something just in the last few years. Funnily enough, since COVID, I think COVID. I don't know about you guys, but I think COVID has challenged a hell of a lot of us existentially. And a bunch of my friends and colleagues and stuff have come out of COVID has changed people, right?
mm-hmm.
And perhaps the amount of time we had to reflect, we weren't allowed to do the stuff people had to look for alternative ways of occupying their time. And for me, I turned to kind of online philosophy and science, right? And it just changed everything for me.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel that it's a culmination of what I've been doing before. It's not discontinuous, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that you go through these phases in life where you sort of think, now I understand why I was doing that, right?
Yep,
And now it fits into this kind of emerging sort of puzzle.
exactly.
And I say puzzle because it still can't be fathomed, but
Yep.
it's there does seem to be a sense of direction that I'm not really consciously in control. Sometimes
Yeah.
I feel like a passenger. I mean, to bounce back a question here, actually. So if you is there a way in which you could give yourself over to synchrony? You talked about the possibility of it being maybe misused or misunderstood, but if you give yourself over to it, you're almost a passenger in a way, aren't you?
Well, it's almost because I feel like it's something you have to somewhat like, at least in my experience, because my normal life is not following attempting to touch the creatures and put it, that there is some level of intentionality to at least turning towards synchronicity. And then there's an effort in maintaining, like, again, he said, if you're going to ride the creature, then there's some level of effort in some maintaining that.
I suppose I was just asking, is there a complete kind of, is it like, letting the daimon kind of take complete control?
No, I don't
right,
think
okay.
So. Because you're never a complete passenger, is the thing,
Yeah, it requires participation, doesn't it? It does.
Well, it's
because you have to observe it to start with,
Yeah, it's not just that it requires participation, but if you give yourself over to it, it's like what I was saying before. It quickly terminates in some kind of self-referential, self-validating kind of fantasy, because the orienting signal is always pointing to what it is about reality that transcends your habitual way of thinking and talking about it. So, if you're cultivating a state of mind where you're sort of trying to get closer to that and trying to touch it, I mean, obviously there's intentionality involved in the first place in terms of cultivating that, you're deciding to try to, I guess, harmonize with synchronicity, and you're deciding to try to kind of synchronize, I guess, but also I think there's a sense in which it opens you up to, because like synchronicity, part of how you should think about it is like you have these, and this actually links up with something I heard you talking about in one of your discussions about free will. But you have these cycles, right, that you are sealed into that like repeat, and they're cycles of your own design, right? It's like you have a certain way of relating to the world, and that certain way of relating has certain consequences, and you've suffered those consequences before, but you still haven't figured out it's your fault and how you're doing it, and so it happens to you again. You know, that's rough sketch, but that's kind of like a, you know, a fairly common experience, I think, for humans. And the thing about synchronicity is that it's like, so rather than being a passenger in that sense, right? Like you talked about free will as being like, you know, what you, I guess, utilize in those moments when you're kind of trying to, when you choose to transcend a cycle, you know, when you choose to transcend
Did I
some
say that?
You didn't use those exact words, but what I've got here is
That sounds far too clever for
you
me.
locate. Here, I'll quote you. You locate free will not in the sequential causal chains, but in some kind of war room or strategic layer. So you kind of talk about it as not in the sense of the weather blasting you into the rocks, but how you rebuild the ship after such a blasting, what you learn from the blasting, whether you allow a blasting like that to happen again. Which I think is brilliant. That's brilliant
Really?
because it's because you're locating free will in the capacity of creatures like us to reflect on our past way of being and to decide to be a new thing, to decide to be different. You know.
Yeah, and it speaks to what Alexander was saying earlier as well about that coordinating, that presence within.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's what synchronicity is tied up in. Is it's tied up in this tendency, like, you know, I guess when I think of, you know, like what you described, that experience of looking back and being like, oh, that's why I was doing that. The way I relate to that is, oh, it's almost like I knew on a level deeper than my conscious self. I knew what direction I needed to go in. I knew what I needed to be doing. And like rare moments I come to see in that side kind of, that's why I'm doing what I'm doing. That's self-consciousness, that realization. And those moments are the moments where we are able to decide, now that I see why I am the way I am, I can decide, whether does that serve me? Do I want to be different? And if I want to be different, how do I want to be? And then there's that moment of creation of a new picture of who you'd like to be, a new way of relating.
That's really interesting. So again, it's kind of like deontologizing it. You're saying in some sense, it doesn't matter whether there was some kind of directional purpose, but the fact that you've noticed that that you've taken a pause, you've interceded within your own kind of passage of experience.
And I identify that not only with free will, but with self-consciousness, like that coming to see why you do what you do. That's the essence of self-consciousness.
Right. Yeah. So each and every one of us is probably about 100 PhDs. You know, so it's like we could spend a lifetime kind of working on this stuff. But you know, it's but yeah, again, it's about the extent to which it's useful for you and those around us.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think, you know, synchronicity is a great guide when it comes to that, because people naturally orient towards what is meaningful, you know, and that's one of the reasons, you know, when you were talking before, you were like, you know, one way you could think of this maybe as maybe this conversation is like that. And I'm like, well, we planned for 2 hours. We're coming up on 4.5. So it's for me, it's like, well, duh. Yeah. The spirit's definitely.
We do this every week now.
Well, exactly, man, you know, and it's conversations like this where, you know, this is the kind of conversation we had with Matt Segal, and actually also interestingly, the kind of conversation we had with Brendan. We're on a little bit of a hot streak, actually. But where, you know, it's a conversation where it's resonant to the degree where you're like, nobody wants it to end. You're like, okay, there are logistical constraints. Obviously, we got to go at some point. We get hungry, we get tired, but it's like, this is magic, man. And we, you know, you want to get back on that as soon as possible. And there is something addictive about it, like Alexander was saying.
Yeah. Especially again, as you know that it remains a mystery. Yeah. And so you're always on that path together, the yellow brick road, or you know.
Yeah.
And I think some of the, you know, actually that leads me towards people like Patrick Harper, one of my guests, and you know, one of his kind of, maybe he would deny that it's a metaphysical claim, but he thinks that imagination is the ground of all things, you know. And so he talks about the importance of the daimon, and Socrates had his daimon, and it was, you know, he was offered that. You know, when his daimon stopped talking to him, which is why he made the decision to just take the hemlock. You know, and even piss off his, you know, rebel against his own life and his friends and social expectations and stuff. You know.
Yeah, no, actually, that's what it reminded me of when you were talking before about how, you know, when you were a child, you used to have these trances, and you described this immersion. I had a couple of anecdotes that came to mind. One of them was Socrates. There's an anecdote from some of his friends about how one day he like received the divine sign, he called it. He felt the presence of his daemon, and he just stood there for like 8 hours in the same fucking spots. And it's like, that's some dedication, man. That's someone who really believes in the legitimacy of that mystical sign, whatever that is. That, and it reminds me of what you were saying, that immersion where you just totally get in this trance state. And there's a great anecdote actually about I think it's about Schopenhauer, about how one day he was like he was walking around like thinking, wondering about the world or whatever, and anyway, so someone shouts out, "Hey, who are you and what do you think you're doing?" And he looks down and he's standing in the middle of a flower bed, like, this is a gardener. Gardener's yelling at him, and he stands there for a couple of seconds and looks at the gardener and he says, oh fuck, what's the line? It's something like, I'd be really glad if only I knew the answer to that, something like that, like, because he takes that question as, in its full metaphysical and existential implications, and he's like, who am I and what am I doing here? Fuck, ain't that the fucking question,
And that points to the majesty of all this, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The very presence, the embodiment of intelligence and consciousness. And for me, this is magic, right?
Yeah.
It's just a magical, beautiful experience. I mean, it's freaking painful sometimes, and don't quite know what to do with myself here and there, but just in and of itself, like, life is a wondrous thing. I think
definitely,
again, that's part of what we're doing as well, is just trying to remind people, what happened to your childhood wonder? The education,
exactly.
The education, or the qualification system has beaten it out of the. Even in my own family, my daughter Soph, it's just tough. I'm going to say this. She always had loads of wonder about science and nature and language and numbers and stuff. We used to play maths games and words games, but she's lost interest, unfortunately. It's she's a teenage girl. I have my moments.
Other more important things on her mind.
But the problem is, the structure of school is kind of very tight. It's autocratic. It's like, they line them up. They send police in there with sniffer dogs. It's kind of it's like a freaking, it's a camp. It's a
There's a really good talk, an animation by Ken Robinson, all about how schools were invented. In the 250 years ago, alongside the factory, and how they're basically still based on factory lines, ringing bells.
The ring bell. The bell ringing is such a great example, right? Where do we get that concept of ringing the bell? Yeah.
I mean, I don't want to sort of downplay the efforts of teachers and so on. I did do a talk on this. I mean, I think they're almost in an impossible situation, really, in some sense. But again, there's a lot in here, actually. This idea of the way that children arguably historically were raised with nomadic groups, parental lineage wasn't so clear. Echoes of McKenna here, whereas now we have these nuclear families and stuff. But what I was going to say is that actually, in some sense, we've just carried that forward and scaled it up, because actually our kids go to school every single day. They go out 8 o'clock in the morning, come back at 5 in the evening, as do the parents, who are usually both working these days. And so the state or the tribe is still looking after the kids and raising them, but anyway, so I think there's some real confusion around all of that stuff. But though, back to the magic of existence.
Yes, please.
Our very presence here, it's just phenomenal. The little bits of nature communicating with other little bits of nature. To what end, though, guys? And is there
ever greater awakening?
A greater awakening of everything.
Ever greater awakening. Yeah.
Right. There's some sense, of like, how do we measure the development of consciousness, and different models have attempted to do that in terms of like even just from a Jungian perspective, you think about, well, consciousness is like growing by bringing the unconscious into light, like it's becoming aware, and there's an awareness piece. There's like a consciousness is kind of like the knowing or knowledge of what's there, or like who am I, answering question, who am I? So there's some sense that the unconscious is this, like the iceberg analogy. You've got like the small amount of consciousness on top, and there's this huge iceberg underneath, is sort of as deep as you can imagine. But then, like, maybe that analogy applies as well to we could apply it to other domains. And maybe coming back to even synchronicity here, and one of your questions you asked, Matt, around like, I can't remember the exact words of your question, but the answer I have in my mind is that maybe there is an unconscious way of relating to a group entity as well. Like that maybe in the same way that a city has an entity that is,
Yeah.
has a pro-social or whatever the word is, there's an unconscious aspect. And that unconscious aspect is actually what's mostly playing out in the majority of people who are not able to take that into the light of consciousness or awaken that within themselves in their own personal journey.
Right.
Yeah, I really like that. It brings me back to the example of the Taoist rainmaker. Like there's a kind of an unconscious, I don't know, mastery that's part of what the meditative tradition in Buddhism. That's where the stopping the noise or whatever concept comes from. Is the thought that you know that spontaneously you're capable of things that you can scarcely imagine, and that like a lot of what sort of inhibits your capacity to realize those potentials is the meddling nature of the conscious mind, always wanting to have a finger in the pie, always wanting to be in control.
Yeah. I mean, real daft example, but after a couple of pints, I'm really good at pool, right?
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
that's not a daft example at all. That's
You
a
know,
friggin' excellent example.
and there are these moments where I just know that ball's going in. And
Yeah.
I get into this kind of like trance-like state, and I can just
Yep.
clear the table, and I won't miss anything. I'm playing with the worst cue you can make. We've got no chalk, and it really gets on my mate's nerves.
I like to think of that kind of example as like the inherent nature of your mathematical mind. It's kind of like you are doing the calculations, like in the same way that you might catch a ball that you're seeing flying
Yeah,
through the air. You're
exactly.
kind of unconsciously calculating everything that you need to do in order to get to the right position and catch it. And in the same way, like when we're getting out of our own way, in the sense, we're kind of able to do these things like calculate or
Exactly.
play an instrument better, or like it's self-doubt. It's like the killer
Yeah.
of creativity.
Yeah,
And
exactly. So it's so interesting because self-consciousness is on the one hand this incredible boon, and then on the other hand it's like constantly getting in the way of our natural powers. It's very strange, the paradoxical nature of it. Because in some sense, it's like what you were talking before, Alexander, in terms of like, integrating those other aspects of yourself and having that relationship and instituting that order within your soul, which actually is an idea that goes back to Plato, putting the different parts of yourself in a certain relationship that sort of serves you.